In the last episode, we plunged beneath the streets and looked at Rome's concealed functionings from the perspective of the city's resident goddess of the sewer. But from the ancient capital's squalid underbelly, we rise in this episode to its dizziest heights. Today we will consider a goddess who is ultra-visible, omnipresent, and almost synonymous with Rome and her self-presentation. If you think about all the things that spring most readily to mind when you hear the words Roman Empire, no doubt you see soldiers, cohorts, legions, far-flung battles, conquest, captured peoples, the grinding engines of war and domination, triumphing generals, and the fight for glory. And this is much the same as what ancient people imagined too, because this is how Rome depicted itself on all the public monuments and its iconography, you might say in its propaganda. Rome was a martial society. It was born out of war. This was a people who traced themselves back to Mars after all, and the god of war was the divine father of the Roman people. But while you might know the actual history and the details of some of the military disasters, the inconclusive outcomes, the ongoing rebellions from supposedly conquered peoples, the losses and defeats, that's not the abiding impression, is it? When we think about all those expansionist imperial wars with other nations, we think mostly in terms of success, irresistible power, and the ongoing, inevitable seeming triumph of Rome. All of this imagery, rhetoric, and grandeur all rests on one overarching concept, one pervasive ideal, that of victory. It wasn't just that Rome waged war, it was that it was eminently successful in it. Rome was victorious. An endless war meant endless victory. Even the celebrated Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was an ideal predicated on war and victory. Victory was endless proof of Rome's ability to crush enemies and conquer, and proof of the divine will that she should do so and would continue to do so. Proof that the gods were on Rome's side. Proof that the eternal city was the eternal, triumphant victor. As I've been speaking, in amongst all the images of conquering generals, the fanfare of chariots and processions and glory-seeking emperors, it's very likely that you've also already seen in your mind's eye the goddess to whom we now turn, Victoria, that is, victory with a capital V, the personified goddess of victory who embodied and deified Rome's ideology of triumph. Winged victories can be seen on everything from coins to the sculptural reliefs of temples. She's everywhere, placing her laurel wreath, that crown of victory, on the heads of Rome's greatest and most powerful figures. She represents the empire's manifest destiny. She's the theological justification behind Rome's imperial project. And yet, although she's so much part of that familiar vocabulary of success and power, she draws attention not to herself, but to the head upon which she lays her wreath. And so, although conspicuous, she's almost hidden in plain sight and easily overlooked. So let's look now into that perpetual rustle of palm fronds and explore what lies in the lure of laurels and in the glint of triumphal gold and purple robes. Let us enter the realm of Victoria. In the year 296 BCE, a strange and ominous occurrence had been observed in the Roman Forum, and the Roman populace was afraid. A bronze statue of Victoria, which usually stood upon a stone pedestal, was found now to be standing on the ground below without anyone having moved it. At least no one was supposed to have moved it, and no one dared admit that they had tried to move it. And so it seemed a supernatural event. This was the kind of occurrence that was taken to be portentous in Rome, This sort of thing was an omen. It encoded a message from the gods. And so it was bad enough that the Victory seemed to have stepped off her perch, but it also happened that she was facing in the exact direction from which the Gauls were already approaching the city. The Gauls, Rome's longtime enemy, had joined a coalition with other groups from the Italic Peninsula supporting the Samnites' rebellion against Rome, and they were heading towards the capital. And so this sudden strange behaviour from Victory didn't seem to bode so well. However, a certain Manius stepped up. He was, by birth, an Etruscan, which shone a particular light on him in Rome. Now, the Etruscans had been conquered by Rome by this point, and while their expertise in reading signs and omens was admired and their advice often followed, they were also always othered as a people and so held in permanent suspicion. But history remembers this one as a good Etruscan because his powers of divination were used to support and rally the state. So Manius used his powers to encourage the anxious crowds, instructing people to take heart. Even if Victoria had descended from her pedestal, had she not also stepped forward? Was she not heading out proactively to meet the expected invasion? Why so gloomy? Look, her feet are now firmly planted on the ground. She's braced and ready for the attack. Clearly, this is an excellent sign. Victoria is poised and in control. It can portend nothing except that Rome will maintain all mastery in the war and triumph. So the crowd took comfort in these words, and indeed the Etruscans' interpretation was eventually vindicated and ultimately proven accurate by Rome's victory in a decisive battle against a hostile coalition near a place called Sentinum, which left only the Samnites hanging on in opposition to Roman expansion across the Italic Peninsula. And eventually the Samnite revolt was also crushed. So the omen had come true, and Victory hadn't been knocked off her pedestal as the crowds had feared, but rather she'd led the Roman vanguard, advancing to meet the enemy and led them to success and dominion, just as the Etruscan had predicted. So who was this Victory? Well, the incident is interesting because it's usually asserted that the goddess Victory didn't officially have a cult in Rome until a few years later, when a temple to Victoria was dedicated on the Palatine Hill by Lucius Postumius Megellus, consul of 294 BCE, after his campaign in Samnium. So Livy tells us explicitly that Victoria's temple was vowed during battle and later dedicated. And this textual evidence places an official cult of Victoria, with public recognition and state-funded architecture, in Rome at least by 294 BCE. But it stands to reason that Victoria, as a divine force, must have been conceptually present earlier. And indeed, the story about the statue of Victory and the impact her supposed ominous movement had on the crowd presupposed not only a known and recognizable divine force, but perhaps also a personified one in human form. The 3rd century was a particular moment in Roman history when, seemingly in reaction to increasingly complex military and diplomatic realities after the Samnite Wars and on into the Punic Wars, the state began to intensify its evolution of other divine abstractions. Fides, for example, who was the personification of faith, or Libertas, who is freedom, or Spes, hope. And these were turned into deities with a formal cult. Victoria is thought by many scholars to fit this pattern of taking a quality or an abstract noun like victory and giving it a godhood of its own. But I'm not sure I'm convinced about this in the case of Victoria. Although a transformative time for Rome and for its visions of what it might be and what it could become, with an imperialistic eye looking up now beyond its borders to the world beyond, but it's not as though Rome hadn't been a fractious and warlike state prior to the 3rd century, and it's not like the concept and aspiration of victory was suddenly only now relevant. Perhaps a grand and spanking new temple to Victoria was erected on the Palatine at this time, but personally I doubt that this was the first time that she'd received cult worship in the city. I think as long as Roman culture had been devoted to Mars, and so long as the Roman populace derived their ancestry and origin story from the god of war, victory had always factored in there, one way or another, as part of Roman identity. So instead of arguing that victory only arrived as a full deity in Rome in the 3rd century, some scholars like me think she'd received devotions long before her Palatine temple. Some scholars even point out the prior existence of Vicca Potta, who's a very old Roman or Italic goddess who also had a shrine in central Rome on the Velia. And she may have predated Victoria herself, and although she represented victory, she may not have constituted a personified vision of her. But there was also, of course, the Greek goddess of victory, Nike, who had been the champion of Greek warriors and heroes for long centuries already by this point. And this is one place where the theme of our series comes to the fore, and where Greek myth and religion has definitely obscured Roman realities. We find ourselves very much in the shadows of Olympus in the case of Victoria, because she's routinely equated to and conflated with Nike. You'll hear it endlessly repeated that she's the Roman counterpart to Nike, or the Roman version of Nike. And this is in part true, depending on what you mean by counterpart. Because if you mean that she is, like Nike, a goddess of victory and the place her divine presence holds in both Greek and Roman pantheons as one of championing the victors, then sure, as a rough equivalence, that's fair. But if you mean she's the same goddess, or a carbon copy with a new Latin name, or worse, as people so often carelessly state, yet another deity the Romans allegedly borrowed, in scare quotes, from the Greeks, then no. I repeat, no. She's superficially the same, but structurally, functionally, and ideologically very different, as you'll hopefully understand by the end of this video. Because Victoria has, in all but the most scholarly of circles, lost her personality and local flavour through this easy but lazy and erroneous conflation with Nike, I think the best way to restore her true colours to her is to disambiguate her from Nike. You'll see most clearly what Victoria is and is not as we make that comparison. So we're going to break it down into 3 levels: the conceptual level, the iconographic level, and the cultic, political level. So first, the conceptual level, victory as a divine power. As we've already seen multiple times in this series, early Roman religion was full of divine powers, noumena, who may or may not be personified or conceived of in any particular form. Think of Terminus, the boundary stone, for example, or the Genius Loci in the form perhaps of a snake, and the eerie, numinous divine presence we met on the primordial Capitoline Hill before anyone knew which gods were there. We've noted the Roman predilection to invoke the agency of these deities and divine powers rather than to narrate them. And as I've suggested, victory may long have inhabited the Roman religious landscape in this way, long before our textual evidence begins in the 3rd century. Victory as a divine and manifest outcome rather than a mythologized being. Nike in the Greek tradition, however, is highly narrativized. She has a genealogy. She was the daughter of the river Styx, who put her in the service of Zeus. She had 3 siblings, Kratos, meaning strength or power, Zealous, personifying zeal, and Bia, who is force. She served Zeus, sometimes drove his chariot for him, and fought for him in the War of the Titans. So Zeus let her live on Olympus. In fact, however, she was closely associated with the goddess Athena, so closely that sometimes she turns into only an aspect of Athena. She's often called Athena Nike or Nike Athena, as you've probably heard. Nike is therefore very developed as a mythological character with a backstory that has a very Greek texture, well integrated and well suited to the Greek worldview. Her myth embeds her in a cosmic and moral order. She participates in Zeus's legitimation through force. Nike is part of the Olympian order, triumphing over chaos. So she embodies an ideological structure very different from Rome's divine machinery. At the conceptual level, the most fundamental difference is that Nike is ontologically anchored in the agon, the contest. She's a principle born of struggle and aligned with personal or divine excellence. In Greek, that's arete. So just as in her earliest attestation she was at Zeus's side in the war against the Titans, she remained conceptually entangled with individual prowess, whether athletic or military. Victoria, by contrast, doesn't really have such a mythos or biography. That of Nike could be grafted onto her, but it doesn't really stick. Victoria remains an autonomous cult, not subordinated to Minerva in the way that Nike is often absorbed into Athena in Greece. And when she was subordinated in this way, it was to Jupiter or Mars, as Jupiter Victor or Mars Victor. So Victoria is episodic and instrumental in historical events that tie her to the res publica, to the republic. She doesn't really arise from myth or narrative, but rather from her institutional function. She's the divinized fact of Roman victory. Her reality is as a guarantor of Roman dominion and triumph, and she exists in relation to Rome's historical outcomes. So, functioning conceptually within the Roman system, victory may accompany personal excellence, but in this she serves Rome's greater vision. Her victory is proof of alignment with divine order, mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, and state sanction. So a victorious general may be celebrated, but his victory is a collective triumph for Rome. So let's move on to the iconographic level and consider how victory is depicted and how her nature was communicated visually. Here, Greek influence is undeniable. Once Roman art begins to absorb Hellenistic styles, especially from the late 3rd century BCE onwards, Victoria is depicted as a winged female figure, clearly modelled on the Greek Nike types. They're beautiful, and it's easy to see why Roman artists were so taken with the compelling attractiveness of this imagery. And it's this visual similarity on the whole that's done such a disservice to Victoria in the popular memory. I think the conflation between these two goddesses seems so obvious to a lot of people that it goes largely unquestioned because they look more or less the same in terms of their form and the fact that they both carry palm branches and place wreaths on people's heads. The eyes are convincing, but can also deceive. If we look for signs of the conceptual differences already mentioned manifesting in iconography, then evidence for it abounds. So, while it's true that Roman depictions of Victoria are heavily influenced by Greek iconography, it's important to note that Roman art doesn't simply copy Greek models. It repurposes them within a very different ideological context. Greek representations of Nike are often embedded within that mythological and agonistic setting we discussed that celebrate personal, athletic, or heroic achievements. But Roman depictions, however, always tie her to political and civic success. On Roman coinage, for example, Victoria often appears standing on a globe or driving a quadriga. That's a four-wheeled chariot. Both are direct adaptations of Greek iconographic conventions of divine triumph, but in the Roman context, these images are imbued with a very Roman political purpose and ideology. So while the images are visually similar, the semantic field differs. Victoria standing on a globe is a recurring motif in Roman imagery, often seen in depictions of gods and emperors, signifying the idea of universal victory and symbolizing Rome's dominance over the known world, which is a political and very particular statement of current affairs rather than any mythological one. Victoria in such imagery reinforces the role of victory in validating Roman imperium and the increasingly global scale of Roman dominion. Likewise, victory driving a quadriga, the chariot, was an iconographic motif occurring regularly in Greek art, representing the chariot of victory generally. However, in Rome, the quadriga was symbolic of the triumphal procession and again had very culturally specific and local points of reference. The Roman triumph was, of course, that supreme honor when the state allowed a victorious general to parade through the streets of Rome and be hailed by all the populace to much fanfare and with so much splendor that it bordered on dangerous adoration, but only for a day. So it was the state-sponsored and state-approved celebration of victory. Victory driving the quadriga, therefore again affirms her role in legitimating political and civic victory, martial prowess, and empire building. So yes, Victoria is the personification of victory, but she's the embodiment of Rome's imperial destiny, and her image always ultimately reinforces the message that Roman victory is not a private or individual affair, but a state-sponsored, divinely ordained triumph. So the key point that I'm trying to ram home here is that while the Romans adopt the Greek image of Nike for Victoria, she maintains her own very different politico-religious valence. The instrumentality of Victoria in the Roman narrative of perpetual victory is ultimately a divine force that facilitates and justifies Roman hegemony. She ratifies the success of Roman arms, and the endless successes she crowns legitimates the political structures of the Republic and eventually the Empire. And an absolutely glorious bronze statue of Victoria was discovered in 1826 in Brescia in northern Italy. She stands 2 meters tall and dates to around the 1st century BCE. And originally she had a shield in one hand and was writing the name of the victors on it with the other. And there's this fantastic photograph of the newly emerged Victoria surrounded once again by gentlemen, but this time not in togas, but in rather splendid hats. So finally, moving on to our third section, the cultic and political level. I think the point to be made here must already be obvious. The distinction between Nike and Victoria that I've been making becomes at this point even starker. So not to play down Nike as conceptually thin or institutionally peripheral, she was nothing of the sort. She had serious cultic weight, particularly in Athens, and her temple on the Acropolis, the Temple of Athena Nike, completed in the 5th century BCE, placed her at the heart of the civic religious complex, integrated into the ideology of Athenian imperialism. And both goddesses operated dynamically within their respective ideological systems. But the point is that those ideological systems were distinct and vastly different, and Rome's destiny, and Victoria's role within it, took a vastly different trajectory. Rome developed what the late great Rufus Fiers called Rome's theology of victory. a system in which Roman conquest was seen as a manifestation of the divine will, the result of the gods' favor, and part of a larger, ongoing divine plan. What Virgil once famously described as imperium sine fine, empire without end. Victory represents the gods' ongoing support of Rome's imperial mission. Victory was won in the field and ratified in the temples and fora of Rome, reified through sacrifices, dedications, inscriptions, and processions that sacralized the historical process of expansion. And while victory followed the heads of Rome's triumphing generals during the Republican era, with the establishment of the Principate and the coming of the age of emperors, it was the head of the emperor himself upon whom she began to permanently place her triumphant laurels. We see this transition beginning with Julius Caesar in 48 BCE after his victory in the civil war at Pharsalus and his consolidation of power. Caesar was granted the honor of wearing a laurel wreath at all times, and this was highly significant because the laurel wreath was traditionally a symbol of military triumph, but it was normally worn only during triumphal celebrations. However, Caesar's perpetual wearing of the laurel wreath was a way of emphasizing his status as dictator perpetuo, the dictator in perpetuity, and reflecting his compromising status as the undisputed ruler of Rome and a monarch in all but name. It also conveniently served to cover his bald patch, which he used to try to hide with a comb over, and for this reason Suetonius tells us that of all the honours voted to him by the Senate and the people, there was none which he received or made use of more gladly than the privilege of wearing a laurel wreath at all times. And by wearing the laurel wreath at all times, Caesar was signalling his continuous triumph and drawing on the symbolism of Victoria and the divine endorsement of his rule. This reinforced his own political authority and was part of his broader project to present himself as a quasi-divine figure. So this helped to elevate him within the political and religious framework of Roman power, intertwining his personal image with divine sanction, but it also contributed to the growing tensions around his unprecedented power, which led to his eventual assassination. His nephew and successor Augustus, who finally did topple the Republic, eventually established Victoria as a symbol of dynastic legitimacy. Under Augustus, the theology of victory is made architectonic. Victoria becomes central to the visual and ceremonial grammar of imperial ideology. And the installation of the Ara Victoriae, the altar to victory, in the Senate House is perhaps the clearest expression of this system. Augustus set this altar up in 29 BCE to mark his success over Antony at the Battle of Actium, the battle that effectively crushed any opposition to his rule, and senators were required to offer incense before a gold statue of the goddess. Prayers were also renewed annually for the welfare of the empire, and it was here that they took their oaths of allegiance on the accession of each new emperor. Victoria thus came to function as a guarantor of political legitimacy, the continuity between military triumph and civic governance, but also the literal condition under which senatorial authority could be exercised, which was theological, yes, but with Victoria now backing the imperial seat, also imminently political and coercive. Augustus also placed her in the Forum of Augustus, alongside Mars Ultor and the Divus Julius, that is, Mars the Avenger, the deified Julius Caesar, and the divine guarantor of success. In other words, vengeance, conquest, and divine favor are all intertwined. Victoria appears in imperial coinage as a claim. Rome's victories, and now its emperors, are permanent, fated and sanctioned by the gods. So while Roman Victoria is visually and superficially Hellenized, I hope by now that it's clear that she's structurally, fundamentally different. She doesn't derive from Athena Nike, but absorbs certain Greek artistic conventions to express a fundamentally Roman religious and political idea that victory is a divine mandate essential to Rome's right to universal domination, a theological universalization matching Rome's imperial ideology. In Rome, the imagery of Victoria becomes omnipresent, from coins to triumphal arches, and triumphal arches are, of course, especially obvious places to look out for images of the goddess. But it wasn't only state monuments that employed this imagery. Roman artisans even decorated everyday objects with her imagery. We find her on frescoes, terracotta lamps, and even hairpins. And such artifacts show us that Victoria as a goddess and as an idea was a living part of Roman religion and popular in daily life. She symbolized, after all, the success of the Roman people, and so ordinary citizens could share in this way, even in private households, in Rome's rhetoric of eternal success. Rome rules because the gods will it, and we know the gods will it because Rome always wins. Until it didn't. Christianity put an end to the triumph of Rome and changed the rhetoric to the triumph of Christianity, with the Christ represented as the true victor. And so, if you've been feeling that Victoria is strangely familiar, it's because she's made her way into the modern world, not only in civic monuments that still like to depict her triumphant presence internationally in public places, but she appears, transformed, also in Christian art. She came increasingly to represent Christian ideas about triumph over death. And so there's more than a touch of that old pagan goddess still hovering ethereally in all those depictions of angels. And so Rome's goddess of eternal victory still hasn't laid her laurels down just yet.